We are finalizing our discussion with Dr. Leslie Richard, and there were a few questions from our question and answer that were not able to be answered during our webinar. So we want to go through a couple of those questions and answers for you now. So one of the questions was, Dr. Richard, would you say that understanding the impact and philosophy of white supremacy is foundational to understanding racism? And to be more specific, how do you think that parents or teachers or adults listening can help their children seek out those who are different from them, different backgrounds, when they're in a predominantly white area?
Thank you for that question. I think one thing that's important to think about for both of those questions is who's telling us the story. And the story of white supremacy is born, at least in the US, in the transatlantic slave trade that began 400 years ago. And often we see that when there are groups of people who have colonized or overruled or mistreated other groups of people, they have to have some way to explain that behavior. And often the way it is explained is by thinking of those individuals as being subhuman or not human, or as being inferior to those who are trying to exert control and power. So understanding racism, interestingly, is the idea that one group of people has more power, opportunity, the right to entitlement, the right to goods and services over another group of people. And you can't have racism without the belief that you are somehow superior, because you're basically saying that people who are of another race are not entitled or welcome to or cannot have access to what I do. And that's because I'm basically better than them. Parents, I think, and teachers and even young teens themselves, the first way you can change any narrative is to look for another one. So the main thing I really, and I know, Noemi, I've shared books with you for your children. I think not changing the story, but adding to the story. So as we know, stories are often told to sort of support the storyteller. And because in this country, the narrative of US history, of other cultures, of world history has all been seen from sort of the perspective of white Americans. And there are lots of books that can educate both children about where they come from, but also where other people come from. I grew up learning about different cultures by having my mother and teachers read me, stories about Chinese children or about children in Jamaica, or going to museums. So the first thing is just exposure to what is different. Now, I don't like the word other cultures because when you say other, you're kind of saying there's this one norm, and anything that's different than that norm is other. But I think teaching children that there are a lot of ways to live, be, think in the world is very important. So books and experiences. The next thing is, how much are you as an adult expanding your own social and political and worshiping activities that include other people? If you live in a neighborhood where there's only one type of person, whether that's socioeconomic, racial, religious, you may seek out institutions in other areas that have different types of people intentionally. The thing I think people have to really realize is this all has to be intentional. It doesn't happen by accident. So I don't think parents are necessarily offended if you said, we've been reading a book about, East Indian food, and we want to try to make, I don't know, chicken marsala, and we'd love to have you, teach us how to do that. Well, having people over, I know right now, this is all, of course, you Can't think about the quarantine. Okay, I'm talking about when everything is good and optimal. But reaching out to people, and as long as it's genuine. Now, many people of color have experienced the feeling that sometimes their children or they are being sort of sought after to kind of check a box to say, oh, there's my one whatever friend, my Latina friend, my Black friend, but being genuine to say, I don't know anything about people from X, Y, or Z, and I'd love to get to know more about you. What could we do together? Could we go to a restaurant? Could we? My son was on a basketball team with a lot of Korean boys, and we went and tried all these different foods, and they invited us to Halloween, and we invited, so being on teams that are different cultures. Go to church, even if you don't necessarily have to change what religion you are, but visit churches in different neighborhoods of different types of people. And then if you can be outgoing, be outgoing. Children follow the example of adults. So if at your table, there's never anybody who is different than you, it's very hard for you to say to your child, go on the playground and find somebody different than you.
Well,
Go ahead. Do you have another?
no, I was going to say that's a good segue into another one of the questions, which was, my children are one of a few interracial or non-only white kids in school. Can exposure to movies, particular books, help with understanding some of the microaggressions that they may not even realize is happening, but may be building up and causing trauma?
Yes, that's a very good point. I think there are books, there probably are more now out just because of recent events. I think just a good internet search about books about, there's so many books. Ruby Bridges comes to mind, the book about the little girl who integrated one of the schools in the segregated South, where reading about other things that have happened to other children are the perfect way to talk to your children about things they may have experienced or that other children may have experienced. I don't think it's good necessarily to say, did anybody say anything to you? Or is anybody being mean to you? Is anybody, but at the same time, if you keep exposing them to stories of people similar to them, then that's a perfect time to talk. So it's not just handing your kid a book, but reading with them and saying, this little girl had somebody, not like her because she's in a wheelchair. Have you noticed anybody else not liking people without even knowing them? That kind of thing. That's for littler kids. For bigger kids, I think it's important to let them know, really from late elementary school through high school, that you are aware that they're being subjected to traumatic information, traumatic statements that they may feel uncomfortable with, and that they need to let you as a parent or a teacher know that these things bother them and how they can address them. Because a lot of this is about problem solving, figuring out, okay, what is a good comeback? What is a good way? Who do you get help from? Do you need to get help, or is this one you can handle on your own? But the thing is, I think what happens, as we heard earlier, is that many children and teens don't tell their parents these things until much, much later. One, because they think we're going to cause a ruckus. So that's frightening to them. But I think, movies, yes, anything that has to do with somebody kind of having to overcome a hardship that isn't their responsibility and they really didn't cause, because that's the thing about race, no one can change their skin color or their ethnicity. So I think it's important that, the more stories there are, even telling stories about your own life. That's the other thing. Our kids all think our lives were perfect. But telling them, oh, I remember the time that so-and-so said this to me, or I remember the time, even talking to Caucasian people can be helpful, because there are a lot of people who are against racism and who do recognize microaggressions and who will help you when you think, well, there's this way that sometimes we think that we're being a little overly sensitive, or other people say, what? Or, that didn't mean anything, or I didn't say anything. But when you have an ally and somebody else who kind of gets it, those are people to talk to as well, because sometimes they can have perspective that helps you address the issues.
And so that kind of, I think you've answered this next question, but I'll ask it just to make sure that if there's anything you want to add, is how would you recommend we engage with our preschool, elementary age children to learn what microaggressions are and when they may be experiencing them if you aren't present? Right, so you've kind of hit on some of that, but this is what could we do as parents to help educate?
Well, what's very interesting with little children, I think it's actually more important to let them know how they could be sort of having microaggressions against people, because what they have to understand is the concept. So it's not looking at whether or not somebody said my hair is ugly or not. I think children have to be taught, like, just like when you're teaching your kids about other cultures, you need to tell them also, everyone who is, Asian doesn't eat rice, or everyone who is Puerto Rican doesn't love black beans, or everyone, so that you're teaching your children also to be careful in what they say. And kind of how, even though we learn about different cultures and there's some things that we can generalize, we can't assume anything about an individual. And so you can talk to them about what they put out there. I've had, one of my children had experience with some Asian kids who, were mean to her, and there are Latino kids who were mean to black kids, and there are black kids who were mean to white kids, and there are white kids who, so it's a lot of it is about learning to accept what is different. That can be, and you can do that in a lot of ways: food, clothing. Be careful about who you talk about. Who are you honking at when you're driving? What are you saying about people under your breath, or to your spouse or to your family members? Are you standing up? And this is where I really like to address teachers. So many of these websites now that are talking about Dear whatever private school have talked about how teachers and other adults will witness these things happening and not intervene. And the child who is experiencing a microaggression is usually in the minority. Most kids who are being picked on in any way are not in the majority. For whatever, they might not be the popular kid, or the kid of a certain color, or the sporty kid, or the nerdy kid. And when that happens, they're kind of on their own, and that's where the trauma comes in. So teachers and parents and coaches and Girl Scout leaders, and those are the people who need to really learn what is microaggression, who can give it and take it, and how do you intervene and stop it? Because I think that's the thing that's the most damaging, is the helplessness that it's a form of bullying. So it's the helplessness a child or feels when no one's standing up for them. And for teenagers, it's the feeling that they're wrong. They're never given a chance to show either how good they are, how smart they are, how fast they are. All the negativity is assumed, and that's very, very damaging, and really affects how much people strive to achieve and their motivation if they already feel like they're subpar because of all these little things that they've gotten day in and day out throughout their lives. So it's the adults on that one.
So there's, and I think this is kind of prominent with what we have seen lately with just getting outreach out about getting the vote out. And one of the questions was, are there any programs that you're aware of to help cultural exposure in rural areas? Because there's been a stark difference between urban areas and rural areas. And is there anything that you know of in rural areas that can help with cultural exposure?
It's really interesting, and I could be way off now, but that was one of the tenets of the YMCA and the YWCAs, was to sort of encourage cultural understanding. It would have to be through youth groups and churches. There's really not, in rural areas, if you think about where people come together, it's going to be the school, it's going to be the church, or a recreation sort of environment. I think the main thing is knowing who's in your community. So if you're a person who cares about this, first of all, what's that saying? There's a whole lot that can happen with a village than an individual. So finding like-minded people, if you live in a rural area and you know 2 or 3 people who think we need to meet some other people than just the people in our rural area, anybody have any ideas? Or a cousin or somebody who lives somewhere else, field trips. But the first thing is people have to open their minds, and you don't need other people to open your mind as much as you need just someone putting the things in your mind. So books, videos, conversations, that parents forget about conversations. Those are the things to first start with, and then you bring in the exposure, because you don't want it to blow up in your face if your kids aren't really prepared.
Yeah. So how do you, given where we are kind of in our society right now with being shelter in place and kind of limited mobility, how are microaggressions coming across in Zoom with distance learning? And what should we be on the lookout for? How do you think that those could be recognized via the screen? And when you're in video mode, people sometimes don't turn on their video so they can't see you visually. And they're wondering if there's a lot of assumptions that are happening with children. And so there's just a question around that, because we're living in a different environment since we're having to do it via the screen.
Distance learning is really, really a challenge. I mean, I'm dealing a lot with that. A lot of my patients who have ADHD or autism or things that make it hard to attend. And interestingly, one of my patients who's a teenager who has a lot of anxiety didn't like distance learning because she felt like she was overly exposed. One thing we know about teens is they kind of don't like to be the center without it being their choice. So one thing that distance learning does by having everybody's picture and kind of in your face, people who are kind of shy or want to kind of blend in, they can't do it. So that's one thing. Okay. The second thing is people who don't want to do their work also don't want to be seen, right? So they may turn off their screen. And I think, the microaggression piece is really, once again, it's got to be managed by the teacher, which is hard because some Zoom classrooms, I hear the teachers really don't have much control of the group. If you see these things happening, I think feedback is very important to the teacher. I know that schools that have teachers that can do breakout sessions actually are having more success than when it has to be the whole group together. So, taking people who are a diverse group in the breakout session. So you kind of say, okay, we want 2 boys, 2 girls, and one child of this descent, another child of that descent. Some schools I've been to, interestingly, my children went to Pacific Oaks, which is a very progressive school that even had a preschool and kindergarten program back in the early 90s that they call the anti-bias curriculum. And I walked into a classroom with my daughter, who was about 2.5, and there was another little African-American boy sitting at the table. And the Caucasian teacher walks up to me and says, "Oh, we'll sit here right here with this little boy because they both look alike and they'll probably feel more comfortable." And at first I was a little taken aback. I'm like, why would you assume that she would want to sit with him? But then I know in my heart of hearts, when I left, that I was very happy she was sitting with him because there was someone she had something in common with. So we can't be afraid. It's not like we can't make assumptions in one way, but we also can't be afraid to say people do feel more comfortable. Most little girls don't want to be in a group with 10 boys. They'll want a couple other girls with them, and same, with the other gender. So breakout groups in distance learning can be helpful. The other thing is, you know, if a child feels like other children are commenting on things, you know, having their classroom setting in the same place every day is really important. Getting your kids dressed every day. Some people, you know, don't let your children go to school in their pajamas. I think the less you leave open for commentary, which may not start as a ethnic or racial microaggression, but the more somebody has to say about an individual, the more they will say, right?
Yes.
So, so that's one thing. Distance learning is really truly a challenge. But I think, you know, encourage your children, if something is said that offends them or they think kind of wasn't right or fair, to tell you that, and you'll see if you can help the teacher understand better. That's for little kids. For big kids, your kids need to know you just have their back. You know, I went to a local private all-girls school, and I knew if things didn't, you know, and there were some very interesting things that happened during that time, but I knew my mom was going to be right there. And that's important for your children to know, to, you know, tell them, you assume that they are telling you the truth, and you assume that their perception is what they perceive to have happened. And if that is the case, you have their back. Now that doesn't mean you don't listen. You know, I remember, you know, times, you know, thinking, oh, somebody hurt a little friend of mine, and actually she hurt another little girl. So you can't always assume that your child is never in the wrong. But with microaggressions, I think they need to know that they can come to you and that you will help them figure out a way to solve the problem.
Yes. And I think that, you know, just to add on to that, one of the things I remember when I was in law school, it was always the interpretation of something that's written. 5 different people can see that 5 different ways, and it's the written word, and we can all see it. So I think that's really important in school, in dialogue between teachers and parents. So the perception of what happened in a teacher's eyes compared to what happened in a student's eyes, taking into account all the microaggressions and the trauma that they've already experienced, needs to be heard, not just from the parent, but also needs to be heard from the teachers or any other adult that may be involved. And I think sometimes that's where our kids suffer, because the perception of the adult they're talking to is much different from the child. And so that's where I think we as adults have to, regardless of whether you're a parent, you're a teacher, we have to be open and be willing to listen and hear it from a different angle. And I think that's super important and very necessary for our children, particularly our children who of color, who might be seen as a minority in a lot of these all white or where there's just not a lot of people that look like them.
Yeah, and you know, I think that's what's so great about what you're doing with Mari is, you know, education, 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 exposure, exposure, exposure. And so the more adults learn, and I think in a curriculum-based way, you know, these are informal teachings, but hopefully schools will start to reach out to curriculums that says, you know, okay, how do you teach about Ramadan? How do you teach about Chinese New Year? How, you know, and you know, do you invite parents in to share in the experiences, or are you kind of recreating them on your own? So I think, you know, taking on things in a formalized way, which you guys are doing, I think is fantastic, because that's where you see real change, where year after year, the same people who come through an institution are learning the same thing and to approach certain things in a very particular, specific way. That's been studied.
Yeah. Well, this has been great, Dr. Richard. We appreciate you, coming back and answering these last questions for us, and we hope that we will hear from you again in the future. We would love to have you come and participate in another Mari webinar. So we really do appreciate your time.
Great. Thank you so much. I enjoyed being here. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.